Thanks for joining us on our streaming service for your First Alert drought forecast. I'm your First Alert meteorologist, Callie Zanandri. We picked up some beneficial moisture over the past week, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough to bring widespread drought relief across Colorado. Exceptional drought conditions across the West continue. Nearly 7% of the state, Rio Blanco, Garfield, Mesa, Moffat, and Delta counties are still under exceptional drought conditions. That's that dark red color right there. But we did see some modest improvements in parts of Douglas, Elbert, and Park counties thanks to the recent rainfall. Now, looking ahead to the fall, everyone's wondering what Mother Nature has in store and how the leaves will shape up this year. But this year, our famous fall colors may not be as bright or as long-lasting, and that's all because of drought. To help us understand what's going on in our forests and what we might expect this autumn, we're joined by Dan West. Dan, thank you so much for being here with us.
No, what a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, Dan, what should people expect from this year's fall colors in Colorado?
Well, this year is going to be a bit of a mixed bag. There's, some drought conditions that have occurred, as you've already highlighted, on the more western side of Colorado. The central portions of Colorado and our central mountains seem to be also in drought conditions, but not as extreme or exceptional. And then lastly, but certainly not, by any means less, the eastern plains are faring quite well as far as drought conditions. And so I think it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag moving east to west. We should have a pretty good show if you're looking at riparian river drainages along the eastern plains. And then the Front Range, I think, will look a little bit different than the central mountains and certainly some of the more western mountains. So, we have to wait and see and let Mother Nature play out a little bit.
Now, how does the ongoing drought affect the timing and the intensity of fall colors?
Well, trees lose water through transpiration. That's just a process by which they have to open their tiny little pores to exchange gases. And when they open those pores, they're losing water. And so what ends up happening is that, in these years where we have below average precipitation or much below average precipitation for some locations, ultimately what happens is the tree then starts to either go into early dormancy, and if that happens, then of course it drops its leaves early. And not only that, but the process along the way may cause the tree to start to have some of its tissues die back. And so, when you're walking out through our forest or down on, a stroll that we all do in the fall time, right, you might notice that some of the edges of the leaves are brown. And that's just a result of these drought-stressed trees that are having some marginal necrosis of their leaves. And that does oftentimes cause the leaves to turn slightly more yellow prematurely. And then ultimately, if these conditions persist, they drop their leaves early. So we'll have to wait and see how it all kind of shakes out. But oftentimes, the intensity of the fall colors that we see is somewhat dulled or muted because the leaves are starting to shut down their processes slightly earlier.
Dan, are we seeing long-term changes in the fall color timing or quality as drought becomes more common across Colorado?
Well, looking back on the short history, 2023 and 2024 were really good years. In fact, 2023 was an exceptional year for fall colors leading into the fall season. Trees had put on a lot of growth. So there was lots of full crowns or the tree was really full of leaves. And then we didn't see any of these kind of drought conditions persist. And so I don't think that we're at a stage where we would kind of say that we're, in this pattern of, maybe not having as great of a show or having early fall colors or having them go into dormancy early. It really is year after year. This year just happens to fall on the heels of 2 years that were pretty good.
Yeah, the last 2 years were beautiful. I know you've been out doing some surveying. Tell me about that process and what you're seeing. Are you seeing some trees already looking stressed this fall?
Yeah, typically I'm sitting in aircraft flying over most of our forest resources every year. We fly up and down each drainage looking for any kind of forest disturbance and forest issues. This year, we couple that up again with ground surveys, and this year we've really noticed that kind of drought stress in many of our mountain communities, certainly along the I-70 corridor, and the further west that you get, the worse it gets. Many reports in Breckenridge, and I was out on the ground looking at some of this recently, that many of the aspens along towns and in towns look like they're already starting to turn, but in fact, when you get up close to them, you're just seeing that kind of brown edges and maybe a little bit of yellowing in the internal portion of the leaf. So from afar, the tree might actually look like it's more kind of yellowish or brownish, but when you get up close, you're like, oh, it's actually just more of a tan color. And so, maybe in the northern reaches of Colorado, right along the Wyoming border, I might start to, if you squint and kind of turn your head a little bit, you might kind of say, oh, I'm starting to see, that chlorophyll starting to leave the leaves. And that's the green color that we all see. And then embedded underneath that. So in the springtime, when leaves are first coming out, they have, all these pigments that are in there to capture the sun. And what's underneath all that green color is all these yellows and oranges. And then, the sugars that are within those leaves can produce the reds and the purples when we get those really cool evenings, not cold to the point that it's frozen and we get frost, but those cool evenings and days followed up by really blue skies and sunny days is really what we want, so that we can kind of start to reveal those yellows and oranges that are underneath. And so, maybe we're starting to see just the hint of that in our northern reaches. Typically in Colorado, the northern forests first start to turn, and then it progresses its way to the southern border over time. I typically kind of think about that first week in September as when we might start to see it, the highest elevations and maybe the coldest locations, when you'd start to see some of the leaves starting to turn. We've kind of seen a little bit of that with the, false yellows that we're seeing with some of these drought-induced or stress indicators from some of our trees. But I think we're kind of right on the precipice of starting to see some fall colors here moving into the early part of September.
And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but if you were going to tell someone where the best fall colors are going to be this fall, where do you think they should go and when?
Well, that's always dependent on if you're just looking for aspens, right? We all love aspens. They're kind of that yellow gold in Colorado that we think of, right? If you're looking for aspens, I really think the Front Range is going to kind of be your best bet, because as you go further west and as you go further south, the drought conditions just are worse. And so really, if you're into things other than aspens and you like to see some of those narrow leaf cottonwoods or plains cottonwoods or some of the willows, certainly our riparian areas out on the eastern plains are going to have a great show this year. And then, of course, some of the oaks and things that we get down in the southwest corner that can turn that amazing, orange. And then you also follow that up with the reds and the purples. I think that this year, certainly kind of in the south central part of Colorado would be your best bet for looking at Gamble oak and trying to get some of that orange and red colors.
And you are seeing conditions turn just a bit sooner this year compared to the past years. Is that right, because of the drought?
That's right. Yeah, typically what happens is these trees start going through their dormancy a little bit earlier because of these drought conditions. They're like, gosh, I'm going to start to shut down processes, because they're losing so much water when they're, exchanging gases that they just can't take up enough water. And so they kind of start to shut things down early. I think that typically across Colorado, we might start to see things a few days earlier, maybe even a week to a week and a half in some locations out on the western slope, a little bit earlier than normal. Typically, we would consider that third week and fourth week in the northern mountains of Colorado to be peak. I think it might be more towards the middle part of September this year. And then, of course, it progresses about a week later as you move further south through the state.
Well, here's to hoping for some beautiful fall colors and some more moisture coming our way next year, so we're not dealing with these drought conditions. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Dan, and we will see you back here next week for your First Alert Drought Report.